Good evening. My name is Avinoam Patt. I'm the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies at the University of Connecticut, where I also serve as Director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life. I want to thank you all for joining us here this evening for what should really be a fascinating program on banning Art Spiegelman's Mouse, the politics of Holocaust education and memory in the year 2022. I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening for tonight's program. As many of you already know, on January 10th, 2022, the McMinn County, Tennessee School Board voted unanimously to remove Mouse, Art Spiegelman's graphic memoir about his father's Holocaust experience, from its curriculum after board members raised objections about curse words, new drawings, and, quote, not wise or healthy content within it. The meeting started with a discussion of redacting curse words and offensive images before ultimately ending with a decision to remove the book entirely from the 8th grade language arts curriculum. Acclaimed as, quote, a brutally moving work of art and the most affecting and successful narrative ever done about the Holocaust, and the first masterpiece in comic book history by reviewers, also a Pulitzer Prize winner, Mouse recounts the chilling experiences of Art Spiegelman's father, Vladek, during the Holocaust, with Jews drawn as wide-eyed mice and Nazis as menacing cats. The graphic novel uses the conventions of the comic book to tell the story of his parents' experiences as Polish Jews before, during, and after the Holocaust. It is also a second-generation story about the legacy of the Holocaust on Spiegelman, a survivor's child. As one of our colleagues, Jennifer Kaplan, has noted, Spiegelman took a genre that many could not see as literature and turned it into a medium that could tell stories in a way that no other book could. I want to thank my colleague, Professor Susan Herbst, for first reaching out immediately after this news was reported and suggesting that we organize a panel to discuss the controversy around the politics of Holocaust memory and education in 2022. I also want to thank Dodd Human Rights Impact and the Department of Political Science at the University of Connecticut for co-sponsoring and promoting tonight's program. We have an excellent panel prepared to discuss the topic from varied areas of expertise, including political science, art history and illustration, history, Holocaust studies, German studies, and more. I just want to offer a note about the format for tonight's program. We have three wonderful panelists who will speak, zooming out in order from Tennessee to Connecticut and to more global perspectives on the significance of this news and the significance of Mouse as a work in and of itself. All participants in tonight's meeting are muted in order to minimize disruptions and distractions. I would encourage you at the end of the presentations this evening to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions of our panel, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of our presentations. So without further ado, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome and introduce our three panelists. Cora Lynn Deibler is an illustrator specializing in editorial and children's illustration. Her clients have included the New York Times, the Washington Post, Spider, Cricket, Ladybug, the Oxford University Press, Scholastic Publishing, and Agence France Presse, among others. Awards have included How Magazine, the Print Regional Annual, RSVP, and the New York State Press Association. Her work has appeared in exhibitions at the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Mass., and the Society of Illustrators Museum of American Illustration in New York City, venues showcasing the best in visual narrative work. Her most recent published work is the animation By Our Love, Exposing Paradox and Political Tribalism, a collaborative work with jazz composer and arranger Earl McDonald, facilitated by Greenhouse Studios at the University of Connecticut. She is currently creating her first graphic novel. Cora Lynn is a member of the Society of Illustrators and the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, and currently serves on the Low Illustration Committee at the New Britain Museum of American Art in New Britain, Connecticut. She has been both a faculty member and an administrator at the University of Connecticut since 1997. Susan Herbst was appointed as the 15th president of the University of Connecticut on December 20th, 2010 by the university's Board of Trustees. She stepped down as president on July 1st, 2019 and returned to the faculty. She teaches at the Stamford campus where she is university president, university professor of political science, and president emeritus. Born in New York City and raised in Peekskill, New York, Herbst received her BA in political science from Duke University in 1984 and her PhD in communication theory and research from the University of Southern California's Annenberg School for Communication in Los Angeles in 1989. Dr. Herbst is a scholar of public opinion, media, and American politics, and is the author of 5 books and many articles in these areas. Along with Lawrence R. Jacobs, Adam J. Berinsky, and Francis Lee, she edits the University of Chicago Press Studies in American Politics. Her most recent book, A Troubled Birth, the 1930s and American Public Opinion, was recently published by the University of Chicago Press. Professor Daniel H. Magilow is professor of German in the Department of Modern Foreign Languages and Literatures at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and co-editor-in-chief of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. He was the Pearl Resnick postdoctoral fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in 2005 and 6, at the USHMM 2005 and 6, and currently serves on the academic committee and the academic council of the Holocaust Education Foundation of Northwestern University. Dr. Magilow's research focus centers on photography and film and their intersections with Holocaust studies, Weimar Germany, and post-war memory. He is the author, co-author, editor, or translator of several books, including the Holocaust memoirs In Her Father's Eyes, A Childhood Extinguished by the Holocaust, and It Will Yet Be Heard, a Polish rabbi's witness of the Shoah and survival, as well as The Photography of Crisis, the photo essays of Weimar Germany, and most recently, the 2nd edition of Holocaust Representations in History and Introduction, co-authored with Lisa Silverman. His edition of the collected works of the German photographer Albert Renger-Patsch, titled The Absolute Realist, Albert Renger-Patsch Collected Writings, 1923 to 1967, is forthcoming with Getty Publications. So I want to thank this wonderful panel for joining us this evening. I'm really looking forward to hearing your insights as we discuss this important topic. So as we said, we're going to zoom out from Tennessee and work our way out. So we're going to start our discussion this evening with Professor Dan Magilow. Dan, I'm going to turn the screen over to you. Thank you.
Great. Can you see and hear me? All right. Well, first of all, thanks to Avi, Pat, and to UConn for organizing this event. I'll just dive right in here. It's a real honor for me to speak to you about Art Spiegelman's Maus, because Maus has a special place for me as a teacher and scholar of the Holocaust. I first read Maus as a teenager in the 1980s after my mother, who is with us this evening, hi Mom, my mother, who's a professional artist, showed me the comics anthology Raw, which I'm showing you on screen here in my, can you see this? Okay, the comics anthology Raw, edited by Art Spiegelman and Françoise Mouly. The issues of Raw contained these little comic book-like inserts, each with a chapter of Maus, and these were later combined and published as the 2 volumes that we recognize from as the complete Maus. Maus made a really deep impression on me, and I remember when I read it, I couldn't put it down. And I teach it regularly now. Students always love it. And in fact, as evidence of just how influential this book has been on me, the University of Tennessee Library has a program whereby it purchases a book and puts in a commemorative nameplate when faculty members are promoted and tenured. And so the book that I had picked that had just come out at the time was Meta Maus, which is Spiegelman's kind of reflection on, on Maus and his career, and, it has a little nameplate. So all of this as just, evidence that this book has been really important and really inspiring to me. When I first, sorry, let me show you some of these slides here. I should have been flipping through here. Here's a few issues of Raw. in which Maus appeared. And you can see Spiegelman has a little, little thing, Art Spiegelman Maus, new chapter in the corner. And then this is another image of what these individual comic book-like chapters look like. And then here's MetaMouse. Okay, so when I first read Maus, I was about the same age as the students in McMinn County who are now supposedly being protected from this book. McMinn County is about 60 miles away from where I live in Knoxville, and I've only been there once on August 21st, 2017, because it was one of the best places in the country to see the total solar eclipse. It's a rural county, and this map is also just to give you a sense of where it is. McMinn County is a conservative rural county. It voted about 79.7% for Donald Trump in the 2020 election. And like so many counties in the American South, it has a history of racial intolerance and indeed genocide. So, it was in the 1830s, indigenous Cherokee were expelled from the area. And then, of course, there's Jim Crow, chattel slavery. I mean, you could name the list. But the point I'm trying to make here is that aside from whatever we have to say about Maus or similar Holocaust education books, teaching this particular history in the American South points to a broader question about Holocaust education in the United States. Namely, is learning about the Holocaust a way for Americans to displace local histories of intolerance onto a place in a time far removed while still preserving the moral capital that comes with learning about diversity and intolerance? In other words, it's always easy to learn about what other people's grandparents were doing that was intolerant rather than looking at one's own. And as this map, I think, unfortunately shows, Tennesseans don't have to go to Germany to find episodes of intolerance. So I would argue that this kind of displacement is happening, and that it happens quite often. And one of the things that happens in this teaching of the Holocaust is that it is transformed from a specific episode in the history of anti-Semitism into a kind of universalized morality tale. The Holocaust is not taught as a specific set of events that emerged from the complexity of interwar German history, but as the scholar Jeffrey Chandler terms it, it's taught as the master moral paradigm of the 20th century. That can, end quote, the master moral paradigm is Chandler's phrase, that can teach us about evils of racism and intolerance at all times and places. In the classroom, this stripping away of the Holocaust's Jewish specificity is taking place in what a recent viral tweet by the self-described writer, illustrator, game designer, Nazi puncher, and author of Among the Red Stars, Gwen C. Katz, termed the Pajama Vacation of Holocaust curricula. I think this is the first time in my academic career that I've drawn a theoretical paradigm from Twitter, but it seems apt given where we are. So the term pajamification riffs off of John Boyne's best-selling 2006 young adult historical novel, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which was adapted into a popular film in 2008. Conceptually, pajamification refers to replacing unflinching books like Art Spiegelman's Maus with books like The Boy in the Striped Pajamas that let us remember the Holocaust less as it was and more as we want it to have been. Pajamification can thus be understood as a variant of what scholars term the Americanization of the Holocaust. A key aspect of the Holocaust's Americanization is that books, novels, films, and other representations are produced and marketed in ways that make genocide palatable and redeemable to audiences that consist primarily, although certainly not exclusively, of non-Jewish Americans, typically Protestant, middle class, and suburban, but again, not exclusively. Now, to this end of kind of domesticating the Holocaust, commercial movies and books focus disproportionately on stories of rescue, heroism, and survival, even though those kinds of stories are radical statistical outliers compared to the rest of the killing in the Holocaust. These kinds of representations sugarcoat the Holocaust by narrating it Christologically and redemptively. Jews died so that the rest of us can learn the importance of tolerance. Pajamified representations are thus a particular form of Holocaust commodification that recycles standard tropes of Americanized Holocaust representations while targeting younger audiences, particularly in educational settings. So in other words, pajamification as a kind of subcategory of the Americanization of the Holocaust that is specifically targeting young people. The best known examples of pajamified Holocaust representations are, of course, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, but also other books like The Devil's Arithmetic and The Book Thief. But there are, of course, many, many others. And when you look at some of these titles, and these are from Scholastic, which sells, a big publisher of young adult books, Memoirs of a Holocaust Rescuer, right? True stories of rescues by teens, which are exceptions to what generally happened in the Holocaust. So in other words, these books are problematic because they want to have their cake and eat it too. They're often offered as historical fiction, but they're narrated in profoundly realistic idioms that strongly imply that they are true or at least historically plausible. But more often than not, they are neither true nor plausible. Children deported to Auschwitz who were the age of the protagonists in The Boy in the Striped Pajamas and The Devil's Arithmetic were immediately gassed upon arrival. Second, the tragedy of The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, the best known of these books, the tragedy of that story is not so much the genocide itself, but rather the fact that a naive German boy gets caught up in the genocide. So ultimately, its focus is on German victimhood, not on Jewish victimhood. And in my view, this is both irresponsible and inaccurate, and probably something to be avoided in educational settings. So at this point, I'd like to return to the McMinn County School Board's ban and to the worldwide outrage that it generated. Let me get to my next slide here. So school boards around the US are banning all sorts of books because they are quote unquote divisive or because they supposedly promote critical race theory based on an intellectually dishonest and oversimplified understanding of a complex intersectional legal theory. I would argue that we can interpret this wave of demands that schools avoid so-called divisive topics as a form of backlash against the social justice protests that the murder of George Floyd in 2020 catalyzed, because it's been ever since then that all these school boards are being attacked and demanding, all these bans are being demanded. Even so, Maus is unlike other books that have been banned for being divisive or for supposedly making white children feel guilty about past injustices that they didn't perpetrate, but from which they still might benefit. Supposedly, the McMinn School Board, it tried to nuance what it was saying by putting out this tweet that said that Maus is indeed an important work of literature. It's just a work of literature for adults, not for children. And so they invoked the very murky category of age appropriateness and pointed to several instances in the book, claiming that it was a quote unnecessary use of profanity and nudity. And they also objected to the depiction of suicide. And so this panel that you see here, which is the top center panel that I've put on the detail on the right, it's a little low res, but I think you can see it. This is the particularly offensive panel because it has a depiction of suicide. It has the word bitch in there. It has a naked woman's body in a bathtub, which apparently the McMinn County School Board found this to be sexual. I find that quite a stretch. So in other words, the category of age appropriateness is a bit of a red herring. I mean, is there ever really an appropriate age to learn about systematic government-sponsored genocide for the crime of having been born? I don't have an answer to how old students should be, but I suspect that by the time they're as old as the students affected by the McMinn County School Board's decision, they've very likely seen nudity, profanity, and obscenity akin to or worse than what one finds in Maus. Moreover, the McMinn County School Board failed to grasp that directing profanity and obscenity at Jews and forcing Jews to be publicly naked were tactics that Germans and their local auxiliaries used to humiliate and dehumanize their victims during the Holocaust. So objecting to the presence of these things in Maus has, to me, kind of anti-Semitic echoes, intentionally or not. So in closing, I would say that it's important that educators select teaching materials that don't sugarcoat traumatic history, or that try to redeem it, or that otherwise try to make it more palatable. The Holocaust has to be taught in all of its ugliness. It's not a feel-good story, and attempts to make it more palatable are, to me, incompatible with the imperative that schools teach children how to think critically and to understand that the Holocaust was perpetrated by real people against other real people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. You've given us a lot to think about, both in the specifics of this case, but also as we think of some of the larger implications of this decision. So I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Cora Lynn Deibler, who's going to share with us from her area of expertise on this topic, that is the specifics of illustration, graphic novels, and more. Cora Lynn, the screen is now yours.
Great, and can you see my screen? All right. First, thanks everybody for coming. I think we have a pretty good crowd, and I'm very glad that you're all here. I want to talk a little bit about the ways that visual artists impact our culture, and why the things that we do sometimes have the ability to upset people. So we've all heard this phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Never was that more true, perhaps, than in the late 19th century, when an German-born but American illustrator and political cartoonist, Thomas Nast, who worked for Harper's Weekly, routinely skewered politicians and leaders of local, state, and federal government. And he did actually achieve some really important outcomes with this. This is William Boss Tweed, who ran a corrupt governmental ring in New York City that was called Tammany Hall. And Thomas Nast made it his business to create images of Boss Tweed. And in doing so, they were decidedly unflattering, because he was trying to stir up public sentiment against him. And it had the effect of causing Boss Tweed to speak about these images. And I'm paraphrasing. He basically said, my constituents can't read, so I don't care what anybody writes about me, but everyone can see these damn pictures. And it was true. And as a result of Nast's work, Boss Tweed eventually was prosecuted and went to behind bars, along with the rest of his gang. So the voice of the narrative visual artist, it has a long, long history. It's really important. And artists have, for millennia, actually, created images of cultural and political commentary. But what's new and different now about our landscape, our visual landscape? And that's graphic novels. And I am still considering them new because the field has grown exponentially since Maus was published in 1986. And that really kind of kickstarted the use of graphic novels as personal narratives. So the other thing that's really important about graphic novels is that they're very, very accessible as a literary form. Text and images are effective and memorable, and they speak volumes. You can see that with Nast's work, and it goes from there. Graphic novels also are available to a large audience. Comic-Con in San Diego, that's an annual event. It's the largest single literary event on the planet. So graphic novels, as a result of this accessibility and popularity, naturally become part of school and public libraries, and they take their place in our curricula. So Maus was a game changer, but how did some of this get started? There were predecessors in visual narrative, sequential visual narrative. You can look at the work of Lynn Ward, Franz Masereel, and there's so many others, but they weren't called comics per se. There was a stigma about being known as a comic. Enter Will Eisner, who in 1978 published a semi-autobiographical book called A Contract with God. Now, Will Eisner was known primarily for working in more standard comics at that time. The Spirit is one that some of us who are a little bit older will remember. But it was A Contract with God that were his own stories that really made changes in the field. It was published. It was a collection of 4 stories. This is some of the working material from the book. And it took place in a tenement building in the Bronx. And all 4 stories were also remarkable for the fact that they were pretty grim. They were pretty difficult, and there were really no happy endings. This is some of the finished work that you can see there. And it's, I note here that the character in this story, his daughter passes away. Eisner's daughter also passed away. So the work was not strictly autobiographical, but it was very close. So Eisner opens the door to this acceptance of this type of work published in long form. And Maus kind of kicks it open, right? Maus is serialized in Raw beginning in 1980, and then it's published in book form in 2 parts, and it's a huge success. So as a result of this, just having this available to us culturally, a lot more artists start to tell their own personalized stories in service to much more complex, much more difficult ideas. Naturally, then this work has the potential to upset people, particularly parents who start to fear that their children's values might change if they read these stories and are exposed to these much more difficult ideas. And I like to say the proof is in the banning. Because these images can speak so viscerally and so completely and quickly too, artists who express themselves with these difficult truths have to be prepared for some negative public response. It's bound to happen. And I know that we all know more about these books than we think we do, because I'm going to show a few here that have been censored even recently. And probably quite a few of you have some of these books in your own collections, or you've given them to your children, or your kids have read them at school. This one, Summer, by Mariko and Jillian Tamaki, is a coming of age tale about 2 girls who are probably, I would say, they're late middle school age, or perhaps going into junior high. It's usually challenged for sexual content and language. Now, I find this interesting because when I have read this graphic novel and put myself in the place of these 2 characters, yeah, that's what the landscape looks like when you're that age. This should come as no surprise to anyone who's ever been a kid or knows kids or has kids. Blankets by Craig Thompson is a graphic novel about a young man who's in a very fundamentalist Christian family, and he begins to struggle with that as he grows up and he becomes an adolescent and starts to have romantic feelings for a young woman. Some of the imagery is very direct, and it's often challenged for pornographic images and on the basis of the fact that it questions religion, because we shouldn't be doing that either. Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. This is her memoir of growing up during the Iranian Revolution and the following Iran-Iraq War. This book takes you through all of that. It's definitely challenged for images of torture, for gambling, interestingly, and for images questioning religion, and for depictions of violence. I would love to know how you do a personal memoir of growing up in wartime without depicting violence. I think that's asking an awful lot. And Fun Home, of course, is one that's almost eternally on lists of banned and challenged graphic novels. It's Allison Bechtel's memoir of coming to terms with her closeted bisexual father's death, possibly by suicide. It's not really proven, but it is a possibility. And it's also her own coming out story. So the challenges for this book usually are wrapped around gender identity, sexual orientation, suicide, mental health, depression, and so on and so forth. Allison Bechtel herself says it like this in an interview with Comics Reporter. I do have some desire to push the boundaries of what comics can do. It's been telling complicated stories, but having them be situated in the world of comics. So that accessibility of the text and image intertwined is what's important to her in terms of this storytelling. So there's a complexity to this, though, that even the artists who make this work struggle with, because artists are human after all. And so we inhabit different identities. We're an artist one moment, a father the next, a sister the next, or a daughter, an aunt or uncle. You know, these things are shifting, and they're always a part of what you're bringing to the work. So interestingly, this piece from the New Yorker in 1993 features Art Spiegelman and Maurice Sendak, children's book author and illustrator, who many of us know, talking about these issues. And even Spiegelman has these questions about protecting children from difficult ideas and difficult histories. But Sendak says you can't protect kids. They know everything. And when he states in the very last panel, I knew terrible things, but I knew I mustn't let adults know that I knew. It would scare them. I think that's often behind a lot of adults wanting to prevent their children from seeing this work as well. I think they know that their kids know. They don't want to think about their kids having these thoughts. But Spiegelman makes this incredibly difficult historical tale very accessible. That's its power, and it's part of the ability that it has to frighten us into wanting to push it away. He uses animals as metaphors. Now, Daniel mentioned MetaMouse. It's a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, I would recommend it. He goes through a considerable amount of the book talking about the choice of using mice and cats, and it's much more complex than how I'm making it here, but this is the part that I wanted to present. But using animals as metaphors, this is something that artists do here and there. It allows us to relate to the mice, or even imagine ourselves in the story, even if this is not our family's history. So Scott McCloud in Understanding Comics really understands this and lays it out pretty easily for us to understand too. By simplifying a character, we're more able to insert ourselves into the character. A character that's less specifically human lets us come into the character and become part of the story. I think those bottom two panels here from Understanding Comics really show quite graphically what he's talking about. So another element that's true in most comics is this thing called the gutter, and that's the space between images. That space is actually a very active space. In that space, your mind fills in what's happening between panels. And that's another aspect of Mouse or many other comics. Your imagination is allowed to be there and play a role and help fulfill the story. So I liken that to the way I think of it is the difference between reading a book and seeing the film that's made from the book. So for example, a personal example, I have watched The Shining and it terrifies me, but I've never been able to read the book. I've only ever been able to partially read the book. It scares me too much because my mind is doing its own thing, and that's far worse, right? So your imagination is a really potent element of comics because you bring that to what you're reading. And by the way, I tried to read that book in broad daylight on a beach. I still couldn't do it. So Mouse is an incredibly powerful Holocaust story. And it uses this potent communication set of tools that are available to a graphic novelist. And that's been a big part of its success. Now, Mouse exists in the current time within a world that consists of rising anti-Semitism, rising and renewed interest in far-right political parties. And there are plenty of countries where these far-right parties that have been revived actually have a seat at the table of their governments. There's also increasing populism and nationalism, including the United States, and worldwide pushback against immigrants. This piece is from the New Yorker, 2002, and I thought it was a fine example of showing how fascism is becoming not just more present, but acceptable. So combine that context with the fear that our children's values will shift from our own if they read a book that we don't like. Then parents, school boards, and politicians spring into action. You know, they can't help themselves. And what's different now, books have always been banned and challenged. That's not new. What's different now is that social media guarantees that this happens faster and wider. It's wider spread because the increase is inevitable. If you act on something one day, it can be online, and you can do something in Tennessee and it can cause another action in Texas, another action in Washington State, another action in Illinois the very next day. I mean, look, this is why we're here tonight, right? So information travels so much wider and so much faster. So my advice to you is to remember that books removed from a curriculum are not removed from the world, and we should support the books that we want to support. We should make sure that they're available to people. You can take a book out of the curriculum, but you can't get rid of the book necessarily. And my advice to you would be to read banned comic books.
Thank you so much, Cora, for a fascinating presentation, and also offering that broader context about the genre and the development of the genre. And I'll just, before I turn it over to Susan Herbst, I'll just mention that some of the people who were here with us this evening were here with us last week when we had a program on the work of Maurice Sendak, and this very discussion of that we see repeatedly in his work about that you can't protect children. There is sort of this no way to create an artificial divide. And as you alluded to also with MetaMouse, it's a phenomenal sort of the authoritative work for us to understand both the creation and the context of the creation of the work. And you can hear the interviews with his father that form sort of the background for the work itself. So I'm gonna, now it's my great pleasure to turn it over to our third, last but not least speaker, the wonderful Professor Susan Herbst, who will offer some broader political insights as we think about the political significance of these developments in our moment and the broader context of American political history. Professor Herbst.
Hey, thanks so much, Avi, and to Sierra for making this possible. And great talks by Cora and Dan. Really, so glad you accepted our invitation. So like a lot of you, I read Maus decades ago when it first appeared, and I've taught it in a bunch of courses over time, mostly classes in mass media and collective memory, but I've never taught it in a period like ours that is fraught with so much blatant anti-Semitism and so much political division. So I thought I'd just add some insights. You know, Ari mentioned earlier that we're going to pull out, you know, from the work of Maus, from the Holocaust, toward the much bigger picture of our political culture. Thought I would talk about what political science can bring to, contemporary political science can bring to this debate over Maus, and about how anti-Semitism is taught. And I'm not going to talk about the far right wing. I'm going to talk about conventional, down the middle American politics as we see it today. So two things I wanted to mention from our political science research that's going on right now. And the first is about political polarization, something that all of you are deeply enmeshed in and very familiar with. But I want to break open that black box a little bit. And then the second point I wanted to make is about the nationalizing of local community politics and discourse. So let me start with polarization. We do have a cottage industry in political science right now that expanded greatly during the Obama years, with a lot of our sharpest people in the field working on it, trying to figure out whether we're more polarized, red and blue, right and left, than previous periods, why we're more polarized, which issues are we more polarized on, which regions of the country are more polarized, and how our polarization, our divisions are manifest. So until very recently, scholars thought, people who study politics thought, and the evidence is pretty sound, that political elites like members of Congress or people elected to state houses, were increasingly radicalized, polarized, but the general American public was still pretty moderate. So that was our conventional wisdom for decades, really. Most people were in the middle of the road, most of the American public in the middle of the road on most issues, but elites are the ones who carry on with their hair on fire in their journals, in their magazines, on cable news, in social media, on the floors of Congress, on the floors of state legislatures. But really, we can be assured that the American public is pretty moderate still. This has changed, and it took us a while in political science to admit and to figure out through measurement that it changed. And it changed particularly with the rise of Trump and more entrenched social media, where we're starting to see how that solid, reliable moderation that we always thought was in the public, where it's really starting to disappear. So a lot of scholars argue that it's not that people are actually changing their opinions, moving further to the right or further to the left and becoming more extreme. Instead, more sophisticated understanding of what's going on is what we call partisan sorting, that average American citizens are starting to self-sort more cleanly into parties or sides, just not seeing themselves in the middle anymore. It used to be a proud thing to be moderate, to be in the middle, and that's not a comfortable place for people anymore. So just to give an example of this, it's not that a person worried about, say, Central American immigration to the United States got so much more anti-immigrant or intolerant over the last 5 years. It's that they've come to identify the Republicans, for example, in this case, as clearly tighter on immigration. So they go Republican with greater fervency and steadiness. And since political elites, starting with Gingrich and the 90s are transformational in American politics and polarization, political elites starting in the 90s make it clear that it's all or nothing. You don't think that you can switch parties depending on the issue. You've got to stick with the party you self-sorted into, the party that you agree with on most issues that matter to you. You've chosen your team, you've chosen your loyalty, and now it's about that. And Trump certainly strengthened this, legitimating disdain for your opponents. You're for me, you're against me, no subtlety, no moderation, no ambivalence, no openness allowed. So there's this partisan self-sort into categories. Again, not necessarily that we're ourselves moving our opinions right or left, but more through the sorting is how we're getting the division. There's the partisan self-sort, and then there's also, relatedly, geographic self-sorting. So there's no question that more people move to or stay in areas of the country where they feel more comfortable. Red states, blue states, and down to cities and communities. So this is a continuing line of research, but you probably heard liberal people say, I'll never leave the mid-Atlantic, I'll never leave my bubble, or conservative people prefer a place like Missouri or Indiana where they feel more comfortable. So with regard to Mouse, I think you're seeing the sort in action by partisanship and by geography. Some conservatives sense there is worrisome, even subversive content in school books, as Cora noted, and believe Republican leaders are more likely to challenge teachers' curricular decisions and let parents rule. So that particular issue demands that they sort to the right. But they've also self-sorted into school districts, into regions, into states that are more comfortable to them. So Mouse gets banned in a red state of a red area of Tennessee, and not in Brooklyn. So once you understand sorting, you see how the polarization happens, more technically, and how it enables what I think is irrational activity like book banning or closely related fear of critical race theory. And Dan pointed out in his talk that those two are kind of related in their dynamics, and those things happen with lightning speed. So the other idea from political science I wanted to mention is what we call the nationalization of politics and political discourse, what Daniel Hopkins at Penn has named the increasingly United States. And by that, Hopkins, he doesn't mean it in a good way. He doesn't mean that we're increasingly the United States in a happy American togetherness. He's arguing that, as others do too, that nationalization means that people have tremendous difficulty discussing local and community issues in ways that are organic and fit their communities without constantly looking to national discourse for guidance. When an issue gets raised in a community these days, almost immediately it gets put through a strainer, put through a filter. Well, what would Trump think? Or what would Tucker Carlson think about our local issue? What would Rachel Maddow say if she were at this PTA meeting, and so forth? In the past, absolutely, a community would have battled it out over mouse or over critical issues to them that involve their children without immediately looking for cues, for help, for publicity from major political parties and outraged media extremists. But due to polarization and the sorting that I mentioned earlier, the blow it all up, immediate inflammation of all issues, it's inevitable that our communities, our local communities, are overtaken by explosive attention from those who are very, very far away from them in DC, New York, cable TV, radio, podcast stations. So taking a little bit further, we no longer really have local or community identities because our allegiances and our sense of self have become so nationalized. We attach to national partisan brands more than to our neighbors. In fact, it's better not to talk politics with your neighbors these days, especially new neighbors, because you don't know what you're going to find out about what they think. So whether it's critical race theory or mouse, this nationalization of everything will likely continue. It's very dangerous in the cases of racism and anti-Semitism, because every intolerant person in every community can find an internet site to help him or her develop that hatred without having to have any meaningful talk with friends or with neighbors. So I actually would have been impressed had the community in Tennessee had a real empathic discussion of what sort of Holocaust literature is appropriate at what age. That would be a very valid discussion, very interesting and important discussion. Even if that county had, which it did in this case of Tennessee, vote 80% for Trump in 2020. But they never really had the chance. They never really had that empathic, leisurely, thoughtful discussion with their teachers, with their own teachers right nearby, and each other, because structurally and culturally, it's become nearly impossible. More impossible than ever, because local newspapers have been demolished over the last 2 decades, and they've been taken over by these bland, regional chains, by hedge funds in a lot of cases, and they're full of wire stories, AP stories. There really are hardly any experienced reporters living in a local community, reporting on that local community. There are just no jobs in that. So local news really lost its once vital role in helping communities discuss their own issues in their own way, in their own time. I mean, local television news was never great at covering complex issues, and it's just gotten worse, and they just stay alive through crime reporting and sports and weather. So just in closing, there was that expression in the 70s, and I still see it on bumper stickers and whatnot. It was introduced by environmental activists, think globally, act locally. And they meant well, but alas, these days it's worrisome. It's that we can't seem to think or act locally without reference to our own blaring partisan teams and the general thoughtlessness of political extremism. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. And thank you for adding another fascinating perspective to this topic. I think we've had 3 excellent presentations that are asking us to think about this issue in 3 very different ways, both in terms of Holocaust studies, Holocaust education, politics, and then the genre as we think about sort of the use of graphic novels and the impact of graphic novels. I already see that there are a number of questions that are coming into the chat, and I will ask people to please feel free to type questions into the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the time that we have. But before we do that, I do want to start with a question that has come up in each of your talks, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. And I have to say that there is something deeply ironic here, and I was thinking about it in particular as Cora Lynn was presenting about Mouse, that when it originally came out, it was a very controversial publication because it was taking what was essentially sort of a sacred topic, that is the memory of the Holocaust, and rendering it at the time in what was perceived to be kind of, I'm putting in quotation marks, Carlin, but low art form, right? And sort of a number of you alluded to this issue. And so there's this great irony, right? That now we sort of are talking about a school board removing Mouse and the shock and outrage over that, because it seems like it's a sacred text, right? So we can think about the change that's taken place. But I do, the subtitle of our program this evening was the politics of Holocaust memory and education in 2022. And I'm wondering, based on each of your remarks, if it's possible, as we think about teaching about the Holocaust in McMinn County or anywhere, here in the state of Connecticut, we have a mandate that requires a teaching of the Holocaust, but it could be done in any number of ways. So on the one hand, I think 8th grade language arts curriculum, they were teaching Mouse, good, they're having this conversation, but now we're talking about the fact of removing it. But I do wonder if it's possible for us to separate out the politics from any of this, or are all these conversations about Holocaust education, about Holocaust memory, are they going to be wrapped up in the politics of the issues? Dan, I'm going to start with you because you've written about Holocaust representations in history, but I'd be curious to hear all of your thoughts about this. As we think about, on the one hand, how important it is to remember the Holocaust, to teach about the Holocaust now, 75 years after the end of the war, with the passing of the survivor generation, can we separate out here in the American context, and we can think about more globally, can we separate out the politics from how we teach about it, how we remember the Holocaust in any way?
That's a good question. I have, I guess, two answers. I mean, the first one is, I don't think there's a space outside the political. And indeed, I think the claim that something is apolitical is itself a political position that has long been used to justify certain kinds of discriminatory policies. So on a kind of broader theoretical level, I would say, yes, it's political. But I think more specifically, I do think these things are political, because if they're not political in some way, what's the point? By which I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the controversy that the Holocaust Museum found itself in, when was that, a year and a half ago or so, when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez referred to the camps for immigrants down at the U.S.-Mexican border as concentration camps, which I think to most Holocaust historians and historians in general is an accurate description of them. The term has baggage, but that's what they were. They're concentration camps. And then the museum said, well, we can't go around making these kinds of analogies. You can't just call everything the Holocaust. You can't you can't just make these analogies. And there was a pretty severe backlash from academics saying, well, if we can't use analogies with anything, then what are we doing? What's the point of any of this? So it may not always rise to that level, but I do think that the political does inhabit these issues, and I think it should inhabit these issues.
Thanks, Dan. Susan or Corlin, I don't know if you have anything you want to add on that topic of the politics of Holocaust education in this time in which we're living.
Oh, go ahead, Cora.
You're muted, Corlin.
Yeah, I couldn't unmute using the unmute button. Somebody doesn't want me to say this. I'm kidding. So I'm just going to jump in here before Susan, because I just wanted to say that, well, after hearing Susan's talk, I'm going to say, no, it's always going to be political. I thought that was really informative. And I learned a lot from what you had to say. But I guess on an individual note, I would say that I'll approach this as a teacher myself, that so can we separate politics from how we teach about the Holocaust? I think as individuals, I would say, yes, it's possible to do that as an individual, depending on the materials that you choose and how you teach about it. And I do think you can make those individual choices as an educator. As I'm going to say, as an institution, as institutions go, or systems, I'm going to say no there, because they are always a public face. And I think that that's where I would draw the line. And so that's kind of an individual response.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with Dan. Of course, I think politics is in everything. It's why I became a political scientist, I guess. It's funny. I heard Dr. Fauci on the radio today, somebody who, I admire so greatly, who's going to go down as one of the great Americans. And he said, I'm apolitical. I have always been apolitical. I don't do politics. And I thought, oh, Dr. Fauci, I think that are you still saying that really? Because, it can't be the case. And it's good that everything's political. It's a way that we get our students to connect to history. I mean, it's hard to teach them about historical events, those historical events, without letting them make parallels for today. I think our big challenge in America is how we talk to each other, and whether we can, hash out our differences in civil ways, and very importantly, in ways that recognize the same stuff as evidence, what constitutes evidence, and how to be able to sit on your hands and listen to the other side without going nuts. And so, I am not adding much more, just piling on to what Dan said.
Yeah, I'm going through the questions, and I'll try to group a number of them together, but I'll just say that it is interesting, right? That, to a number of your points about sort of trying to remove the politics, or being aware that it's impossible to remove the politics from these conversations. And yet at the same time, sort of having a sense that there are certain things that we would hope maybe the memory of certain things could be sort of separated from the political sphere, or at least treated in a way that's not always trivialized in political conversation. So there's a question that actually came from my mom, and I'll just answer that. It actually, Cora Lynn showed a cover of Mouse in Hebrew, and so the answer is yes, it has been published in Hebrew. Although I'll just add an interesting side note about the publication of the work in Hebrew is that this raised all sorts of other issues in the Israeli context, where you had sort of Jews as mice, references in Vladek's testimony to Jews who might have served in the ghetto police and in sort of collaborationist positions, that led to all sorts of other issues that affected the translation, but a different topic.
Wait, Avi, Dan, could you talk about the reception of Mouse in Germany, because you're a German press?
Yeah. I mean, Spiegelman talks about this a bit in MetaMouse. So, this is me kind of, trying to instantly, transmit, what Spiegelman, is saying. Obviously, it was very, I mean, it's interesting because in Central Europe, it was received very well in Germany, but in Poland, it was like, very threatening to many people. But your question was about Germany. He gave a talk, and there's I'm sure now I'll not be able to find it, but he gave a talk in Germany. Spiegelman did, that was, he received some kind of prize, and the name of the talk was like, it was like, what was it? It was like Sonderpreis, meaning special prize, Sonderpreis rather than Sonderkommando. The Sonderkommando being the Jews who burned corpses at Birkenau. And so, it was received in Germany in the late 80s, early 90s, at a time when there was this immense interest in Germany in dealing with Germany's past, right? In German, they call it Vergangenheitsbewältigung, struggling with the past. There was this whole period known as, somewhat pejoratively, but not really, as the memory boom, when just constant public discussions about the Holocaust and Holocaust commemoration, and should we build a memorial, just and so on and so forth. So I think the sort of short answer is I think it struck a nerve very positively in Germany, particularly because of when it came out.
And it is interesting for us to reflect on sort of the way in which the different animals are depicted, and also the reactions. I mean, that there's so much to explore here if we think about sort of the way in which it's the representations that are here, the translations, and the way that different audiences, to use Corlin's sort of phrasing, that they will basically fill in the blanks between the different sort of frames here. And there's so much there in terms of how audiences will interpret and project onto it. So Stephen writes in with a few questions, and I'll try to zoom in on one of the questions, which is, I think it also points to like a different MetaMouse issue, which is for us to think about. So Stephen points out sort of this term banning, right, which we use here in the context of this discussion, and asks us to look very specifically, first of all, at how we use the term banning, but I think also to think about sort of the coverage that surrounds this story, which is that that you have a discussion that takes place on January 10th at a educational board meeting. You can go online and read the minutes of the board meeting. If you ever been part of a board meeting and you think that's dull, go into read the minutes, and you could see how what is said and recorded at a board meeting can become international news. But they're talking about first redacting and sort of removing certain components before it's decided to remove this from the curriculum. But as Stephen points out, there's a difference between removing it from the curriculum and out banning it. So that's one thing that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. But the second thing I'd love to hear your thoughts on is the media coverage, and what this says about our current moment, which is, I think the board meeting was on January 10th. The media explosion was right around International Holocaust Remembrance Day on January 27th. And here we are about 2 weeks later, still talking about this, and sort of burgeoning book sales as a response. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about sort of what this says about the urgency of the moment in which we're living and how things are covered and talked about in this moment. I don't know who wants to start, but please feel free to jump in.
I think, Avi, you kind of answered it. I mean, everything is urgent all at once. I mean, that's part of the difficulty of living as a human being in 2022 is there's no way to turn down the dial. The temperature is so high. There's so much sensitivity. Everybody's a snowflake. I mean, we could call each other snowflakes, but I think it's true on right and left. And we thought that Biden could bring, we mistakenly, naively thought that he could bring some kind of a massive calming effect, that he'd be like, like a little bit of, kind of mass Valium for the country, and kind of bring down the tone of our rhetoric and our reactions to everything, whether it came from the small county in Tennessee or from, Vladimir Putin. But that's not happened at all. And I think it's the case that, there is nothing that can't seem to get an outraged reaction. So I don't know who turns down that temperature if we self-destruct. That's my happy response.
I have a few thoughts on this issue of, the news cycle. The conspiratorial thinker in me says, wow, this school board meeting in McMinn County took place on the 10th, and yet they waited over 2 weeks to sort of spring this information like right on Holocaust Memorial Day, which of course has the effect of profoundly shaming a segment of the American population that already feels, correctly or not, that it is, looked down upon by East Coast media elites, right? That's, as I say, that's the kind of conspiracy thinker in me. But the McMinn County School Board met again about 5 days ago, and I keep checking to see if their minutes are out. And by the way, I put a link to that in the chat if anybody wants to look at it. And they don't have the minutes out yet, right? So whoever was tasked, probably the youngest member of the school board was probably tasked with writing minutes, right? Isn't that how that works? But they haven't yet posted it. So it makes me think, well, maybe they just hadn't posted the minutes until the 26th. And then the story was sprung by a kind of progressive publication here in Tennessee called the Tennessee Holler. And it released this news on the 26th, and then overnight into Yom HaShoah on the 27th. That's when it really kind of gathered steam. But like, is that a coincidence that this would happen on Holocaust Remembrance Day? Is this part of the news cycle, or is this just people not being able to do the minutes in time?
Yeah, interesting. Cora, Lynn, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this sort of banning, removing from curricula, and just also the phenomenon of, on the one hand, right, this is very accessible, right, as you explained,
Right.
sort of this as a type of writing, and it works for young people to read and to be encouraged to read and to learn different things. So tell us sort of where you would categorize this in terms of banning, inclusion in curricula, removal from curricula, sort of how you understand the politics of these educational choices.
Yeah, well, I think sometimes I don't understand the politics of the choices, for sure. But I would say that, yes, as we were kind of headed toward this conversation this evening, I thought more about banning and censorship and what the differences are. And is this really a ban on the book in Tennessee? It's certainly an unfortunate occurrence, absolutely unfortunate. It's not a strong enough word, but the book is still available. The book is in the library. They're not telling students they can't read the book on their own. They're not running the book out of town. So these things are true, but what is also true is something that Susan referred to, which is we can't have nuanced conversations about these things anymore. And especially as an educator, that's the part that I think is the toughest pill to swallow. It is the speed of everything. It's the fact that everything is, as Susan notes, is urgent. It's also because it's urgent, nobody fact checks. So, people jump on social media and offer their opinions, and facts are sort of a nice notion left over there. So there's no fact checking, and there's no real pause for reflection. I fear that these things don't come back. I fear that we've created something that we can't roll it back and bring those things back to us. Now, maybe we can, and we just haven't figured it out yet. Never say never. Perhaps that will happen, but I do think it's important for people to realize that even when the label banned is put on something, chances are good that you can still access this material. You can still find it. You can buy 10 copies of it. Well, you can't right now. You can't buy this anywhere, which you mentioned also, Avi. But you can purchase these books and hand them out, at the school. And what's interesting to me, what we haven't seen a lot of coverage of is what the students themselves have to say, or what they think about this, and how have they reacted to this. I've seen far less on that angle of it than anything else.
Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting point for us to think about in terms of how we, the perhaps contradictory impacts of this, as some have alluded to in the comments. On the one hand, right, sort of the news about this, as we said, leads to a rush on sales of the books, leads to renewed attention on the books, and sort of the irony that we talked about a book that was once deemed controversial now being seen as a must-have to understand memory and post-memory of the Holocaust. And as you allude to, I think one of the other points here that's so important is the complete loss of nuance. And I will, blame social media to a great extent for this, right? Which is, part of the polarization, but also like what we have, in a book like this or in any book where you can delve into the depth and the complexity of an issue and see sort of wrestling with difficult topics, and you just can't have that nuance or that complexity in 200 characters or in short posts or in memes. It's just completely lost. And so that is a very dangerous thing that we see happening. I'll try to get to a couple more questions. There's so many interesting questions that are coming in. A few people have asked about sort of I think this picks up on one of your points, Susan, have asked about the factionalization, radicalization of our politics. Ruth writes in and says, is not such sorting a trope of the past that forms a slide into fascism, not just in America, but in many politically problematic places in our world. Someone else brought up, book burnings or censorship. So I just wonder, and I'll start with you, Susan, on this, but Dan and Cora, if you have something to add, please feel free. What does this say about sort of, Susan, you've written a lot about this, the fears of, our political moment, of the rise of fascism, of the rise of political extremism. What does this say about this, and how do we respond to that?
If you can believe it, the sorting, extreme sorting, self-sorting into the parties, and actually moving your opinions right or left, that kind of polarization. These are two kind of competing hypotheses about what's happening here. They both lead to the same bad place, which could be fascism. I mean, it's taken to their extreme over many years. But one of the reasons we hang on to sorting and we keep trying to figure out what is going on with people and what's going on in their heads in these divisive times is you can pull people back from sorting in ways that you can't from actual, polarization, where people's opinions are getting increasingly rationalized to one end or another. If it's just that they're sorting into camps, and in our case, pretty much two political parties that we have, there may be a way out of it. And there are many people who question both parties and trying to remake those parties from within, or leaving, becoming independent. So sorting is actually weirdly a kind of a hopeful hypothesis that people can be brought back at least to the middle, and maybe even to your side if you want to pull them all the way back.
And Dan, I'll just follow up with you on this point in terms of sort of using the term fascism in this in this context, where you asked before about sort of when we talk about teaching about the Holocaust and we think about the political echoes that we recognize in our moment, what's the point, right? Sort of why else are we teaching this history? And so I just wonder if you can say a little bit more about sort of how we teach about the Holocaust, think about the political lessons that might emerge when we see certain analogies between then and now, but also not sort of over politicize it and not overly make the comparisons either between concentration camps and detention centers, or let's talk about the anti-mask or anti-vaxxer invocation of use of swastikas in the shape of syringes, right? Like we can see it happening in multiple ways. So is there a way to draw on those analogies to learn about our present moment without completely diminishing and trivializing the memory of the Holocaust?
That's a good question. I don't know if I can answer that, but I can, maybe add a few complementary reflections there. I mean, I think we're in a moment of the normalization of Holocaust memory, which is to say, it's becoming, I mean, it's long since become a kind of everyday thing. In the when I teach Holocaust classes, one thing I always show to students is a book that came out in 1959 that was called Holocaust, that was about like a fire at a nightclub. So that in other words, as early as late as like the, almost 1960, before the Adolf Eichmann trial, you could say Holocaust and it didn't even mean what it means today. And so, but fast forward 40, 50, 60 years, now Holocaust means one thing and one thing alone. It is ubiquitous. It is not just in serious discourse, it's in humor. I think one of the comments mentioned humor. I mean, it's everywhere, right? And so how are we to understand this? Well, one argument is that this is evidence of normalization, and that it is finally no longer exceptional. The Holocaust is becoming like other historical traumas, and the way this manifests itself is through things like Holocaust trivialization, like people wearing the yellow stars that says not vaccinated, just trivialization, or in Holocaust denial as a kind of discourse that in an odd way speaks to the power of Holocaust memory. You don't hear people talking about Rwandan genocide denial nearly as much because people don't care about it at all, which is its own tragedy, right? But that there's just so much verbiage around the Holocaust that I think it just it does get the kind of acceleration of the moment politically, I think is reflected in the discourse around the Holocaust. If that, to try to boil this down to one sentence, but that was admittedly a little rambling there.
So we've had so many interesting questions that have come in, but I do want to sort of ask one last question, and I'll give you a chance to offer your concluding thoughts on this topic, which is, so now that we've discussed this issue of removing it from the curriculum, the response to this that we've seen on an international level, the sort of controversies around trying to protect children, how we can protect children. I mean, we see this in so many different ways. I want to ask each of you to reflect on sort of what do we do now, right? What do we take away from this episode that is meaningful and significant, that doesn't just turn into sort of a response that, in 2 weeks we'll wait for the next sort of controversy, and that our, I think 21st century attention spans will just jump from one thing to the next. So what do we take away from this discussion, from this episode, that can be meaningful and significant as we think about how to move forward in a productive way? Cora, Lynn, I'll start with you.
I think one of the things that we could continue to think about is, well, what are the tools at our disposal for moving forward meaningfully? What are the things that we can do that are within our grasp? We do understand that language and traditions and ideas, those things are evolving all the time. And so there is some hope that we can perhaps come back to a place where people can entertain more nuanced conversations. I would like to feel hopeful like that. And so I think in the day-to-day, it would be thinking about, well, what would be my next kind of micro move right in my own sphere of influence? What can I do as an artist? What can I do as a teacher? How can I have a voice? How can I engage other people with that voice and be open to other ideas, right? So for me, I think the way to go forward would be on that, more on that individual level, and hope that in some way that can spread. That would be how I would probably try to think about it.
Thank you. And I'll just say that one of the things that you point out is just about hearing and listening to other people, right? And listening to the pain and the trauma of others is one of the central components of this text, right? Of being able to hear about art and hear about his father and hear about what his father experienced, but also how it affected the next generations, just listening to other people. Susan or Dan? Go ahead, Dan, and I'll let Susan get the last word since it was your idea to organize this whole thing. Yeah.
Well, I mean, one question would be, why do we have to redeem this moment? I mean, like, you know, why is it necessary to come out of this with a kind of lesson at all? And I don't, you know, I don't mean to sound cynical about this, but there's a way in which I think one of the most effective responses to these kinds of actions can sometimes be to not give them the oxygen that they crave. Now, I don't mean ignoring them, but you know, there was an episode that happened here in Knoxville about a dozen years ago, in which a bunch of Ku Klux Klansmen and neo-Nazis and whatnot came to town and started doing their whole thing. And the protesters, instead of engaging them on their terms, ridiculed them. So like when they said white power, the protesters had like baking flour and threw up flour and said, white flour? You know, white shower, you know, and they ridiculed them. And so now when you go into the internet and you write Knoxville Ku Klux Klan, the first hit you get is not about this major controversy. It's about how these people who probably don't deserve the kind of attention they're getting look like complete fools, right? And so there's a way in which humor and art and sort of non-traditional responses to these kinds of controversies, I think can, strangely, sometimes be more effective, in making the point. I can say that, I'm really glad in an odd way that this happened with Maus, because I think Maus is such a remarkable book. Art Spiegelman is such a remarkable artist and just a fascinating person. And if this had happened with Elie Wiesel's Night, I mean, Elie Wiesel passed away. What are we going to talk about, right? But the fact that Spiegelman is still around and he can still talk about this, it's really, to use that overused word, it's really a teachable moment, and I think a really good one. So I guess, what can we do? We can take advantage of this teachable moment.
Thanks, Dan. And I am glad that you brought up and also sort of allude to the power of humor sometimes as a weapon to respond to these situations, which sometimes, we're designing this huge class at UConn on anti-Semitism and how to respond to anti-Semitism. And sometimes the best responses are in the form of humor. So Susan, it was your wonderful idea to organize this panel. And so I'm going to give you the last word before we wrap up.
Well, I don't have much to add to what Dan said, which I think is perfect. I mean, but I think we do need to welcome that all of our horrible politics are now going to be in K-12 debates over curriculum. I mean, I think we've got to get comfortable with that, get used to that as college professors and as just, thoughtful people in the community to offer up our services to be moderators, when there are, big meetings of, over literature or film where teachers need our help. So we've got to be able to do that. The geographic sort works against us. Like, I don't know that people really need me in the local Stanford school debate over curriculum, but I think I could do some good in Tennessee, maybe, if I could get down there. So got to get out of our bubbles somehow or get invited out of them. But I think that college faculty have, can do a lot of good in this.
Great. All right.
It's nice that the University of Tennessee and the University of Connecticut can be on friendly terms in something, beyond women's basketball.
Right.
Right. So there is hope even after lengthy rivalries like this. So I want to thank the three of you really for your time and expertise. This really was a fascinating discussion. So I want to thank you so much for joining us here this evening. I want to thank all of those who were in the audience this evening. We had a wonderful turnout for tonight's event. And thank you for being here and staying with us and joining in this discussion. Yeah, let's have a virtual round of applause for our panelists. And finally, I want to thank our co-sponsors for tonight's program, the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut, DOD Human Rights Impact at UConn, and the Department of Political Science. Thank you all, and thank you everyone who joined us this evening. Yes, this program has been recorded and it will be posted to the UConn Center for Judaic Studies YouTube channel where it will be available. Thank you all, and stay safe, be well, and go read some banned books.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.